Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
As I say, the report is now officially released, but some journalists, some of my colleagues have been looking through it since 8 o'clock this morning and are now able to tell us, it's huge report, as we've been telling us what strikes them, what has come out of this of major significance. Sir John there laying out just some of the issues that he's touched on. We've got Michelle Clifford here, Sam Kiley and Alistair Bunkle. And Michelle, first of all, Sir John there talking about a legal process that was far from satisfactory, that informed the decision and gave the Parliament, not too very far away from us here, the basis on which to vote to take the UK to war.
Yeah, and he was particularly scathing, or the team were particularly scathing about that. I mean, we've had a chance to go through a fraction of the 2.6 million words in that report, ourselves and the other journalists in there, and whilst we didn't spot the word lie in there at any point, I think that is the inference that a lot of people will take from this report, that Tony Blair agreed to go to war with George Bush at least 8 months before the invasion actually took place, and then set about building a case for war. And I think some of the most damning evidence was the evidence in relation to getting the legal basis established. And I think it was particularly astonishing to all of us. There was evidence there that the Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, was giving his legal opinion from the end of 2002 into 2003, but his legal opinion was being kept from his cabinet colleagues. Explicitly, he was told by Jonathan Powell, Blair's Chief of Staff, and by Tony Blair himself that he should not share his legal opinion. And he had an evolution of legal opinion from, yes, you do need a second UN resolution, right up until the eve of war, when he went to the cabinet with these two bits of paper, we were told by people who were there, and he said, no, now we have established, or I have established, that there is a legal case for going to war without a second resolution. But significantly, he gave no explanation as to why his legal opinion had evolved in that way, but also members of the cabinet did not question him.
Sir John had things to say about that, didn't he, about the style of government, the scope of government. Sam, I want to bring you in on the intelligence side, which obviously dovetails with the legal decisions there, and it's quite a lot of what has already been exposed about the quality of that intelligence and then the use and the spin put upon it.
Yeah, I mean, let's take them in order, if you like. The quality of the intelligence is criticised in Sir John's report. In other words, the intelligence agencies themselves are accused of having an ingrained belief that Saddam Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction, even though the United Nations weapons inspectors were repeatedly finding no evidence for an extant weapons
And Sir John
program.
there saying he didn't feel that process had been exhausted, that those avenues remain to be explored.
Yeah, and that's critical because it was backsliding on previous UN Security Council resolutions requiring disarmament that, in a sense, as Michelle's been intimating, was part of making the legal case for war. So Tony Blair, having given this commitment back in July of 2002 to George Bush Jr. to be alongside him, whatever, and that's the critical word, then set about, it would appear, according to what we've been able to gut from this Matters report, building the case, both legally and in what I'm looking at is the intelligence case, which is both an internal discussion within government, but then also going to the international community, ultimately to Parliament, with the famous September 24 so-called dodgy dossier. Now, we picked over that in the past. It's been proven that the 45-minute claim that there was an imminent threat from weapons of mass destruction coming from Saddam Hussein's regime was entirely bogus. I think that has been absolutely nailed here. I mean, just to repeat, he simply says it was not justified. The level of certainty applied to just that one dossier was not justified.
We'll come back to all these dimensions in a moment too, but Alistair, of course, in terms of the timescale that the report covers, well, then we've only really got up to 2003 there, but he continued looking at what happened in British military involvement until 2009.
Yeah, and let me start on a very small positive note. For that short initial invasion that lasted barely a month, Sir John Chilcot said that was successful, but it's faint praise when you bear in mind you've got the might of the US military behind you. You've got Saddam Hussein, who was fairly crippled, and an Iraqi army that barely fought at all. Beyond that, there's very little comfort for the UK military in the rest of this report. They didn't plan properly. They felt that the planning for the post-operation stage was going to be led by the United States and the UN. They relied on there being a benign atmosphere, particularly down in Basra where they were headquartered. And initially there was, in Sir John Chilcot's words, a honeymoon period. But let me focus on one aspect that I think has sort of dominated concerns for the last number of years and during the conflict itself, and that was the lack of equipment, or the perceived lack of equipment, to safely protect British soldiers. And there is not much comfort there. Afghanistan, remember, became a real issue in 2006, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that took away a lot of the vital equipment that the British military relied on. From 2006, the UK military was conducting 2 enduring campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. It did not have the sufficient resources to do so. And one final quote from Sir John Chilcot. He said, "In practice, the UK's most consistent strategic objective in relation to Iraq was to reduce the level of its deployed forces." Basically, once they'd overthrown Saddam Hussein, they wanted to get the hell out of that.
OK, let's get to the big question overshadowing all this. We've got the demonstrators all around us, haven't we? Calling for Tony Blair, some of them calling for Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister, to be tried as a war criminal. What does Sir John have to say that Tony Blair perhaps might fear?
I think the whole legal basis and the fact that, I mean, he said that that Tony Blair and the British government effectively undermined the UN Security Council, and I think there will be a lot more emphasis now on that evolution of opinion. And when you think of a lie or a deceit, it is a deliberate thing, but you can also lie and deceive by omission. And what Tony Blair did not do was share with other members of the cabinet the evolution of an opinion. The Attorney General did not share the evolution of opinion. So I think that certainly the families will be looking at that, seeing that there might now be grounds for pushing the case. It is a fact that the majority of the Security Council felt that the searches by the weapons inspectors should continue. And you heard Sir John Chilcot there say that that process had not been exhausted. But Tony Blair, he has said, had concluded, no, we must go to war.
Well, what do we think? I mean, what do we all think about? Did we get to the bottom then? Did Sir John get to the bottom of the assurances that were given to George W. Bush way back in 2002, maybe even before that, you know, he was going to be beside him come what may?
Yeah, well, I think he did. I mean, there's extracts of a memo that, and the critical word there is that we'll be alongside you, whatever. Now, what that did, arguably, and I think it emerges very strongly from this massive document, is that it blinded both Tony Blair and his administration to the consequences of their action. We picked over the methodology that led to making the case to war and the controversy that surrounded that. But it didn't end there. These demonstrators here are really demonstrating against the consequences of the Iraq invasion. And this report, of course, goes up to 2009. So it is an excoriation, really, of both American and British foreign policy, the failure of the British to make any kind of influence count with the American administration, to the sacking of 400,000 battle-hardened Iraqi servicemen and women, the ending of their pensions, which of course released this hatred onto the streets, the failure to get to grips with the security problems in Basra. They directly suggest, and I think Ali will talk about the failures in Basra more directly, but right across the whole thing, the unpicking of the Iraqi state resulted. This isn't what.
But it's got to be said, though. I mean, the Americans led the way on that. I mean, is there a crumb of comfort for the British in that? Sir John pointed out they were saying to George W. Bush, "What is the plan? Maybe you shouldn't do this. Maybe you should do that." I mean, the Americans are so powerful militarily.
I think the point of this document is that they were not saying that.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is an excoriation of Whitehall officials who, after the fact, have written and said that they were advising against certain things. In this document, that does not come through. What it comes through is that they were ignored at best.
Just hearing that the families are gathering, the relatives of some of those who lost their lives are gathering to make a statement. We're going to keep an eye on that and bring it to you as and when they speak. There you are. You can collected and gathering inside another room in the Queen Elizabeth II Conference Centre here in the heart of Westminster. Alistair, I just want to, that point that Sam flagged up there, and Sir John mentioned it, that it came to militarily in Basra, the UK forces having to do a deal with a militia that have been killing British soldiers.
And he describes that as humiliating. I think for a lot of people, it'll be seen as exactly that. Now, those who would defend that say, you've got to talk to your enemies. I mean, that is just a fact, a dirty fact of war. The reason for it was to ensure safe exit from Basra and a withdrawal from Basra without being another sort of an Alamo. But what it resulted in was a serious falling out with the United States and a lack of respect from the Iraqi government, who then started to take matters into their own hands down in Basra. And I think what comes across and comes through this report at regular cases is the lack of communication between what was happening on the ground and then the senior chiefs here in Whitehall. Or if there was communication, they weren't necessarily being listened to. There already was a channel, there was a strategy that was thought through, there was a political objective, whatever you want to call it. And if a general said, look, I recommend this, that, or that, it wasn't always listened to.
You wanted to come in, Michelle?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you were talking there about Britain being the junior partner exerting leverage. Well, one of the areas where you could argue that Tony Blair was successful was persuading George Bush to go down the UN route. I mean, the neocons in Washington, a lot of them didn't want to do that. They had no truck with the United Nations. I think the problem now is that in the context of everything that we've heard from Sir John Chilcot, people will conclude that going down the UN route was simply to give the veneer of respectability, of legitimacy to something that had been decided. So I think even that will be a difficult.
I mean, we hear that, don't we, in terms of the pre-planning that the Americans were doing. Their military was being ready for a major operation way back in 2002.
Yeah, I mean, I know from, and Sam probably will back this up, I mean, I know some people anecdotally speaking to in the past, he was sort of quite senior in the military in various places. Everybody knew that war was coming. I mean, you know, within the media, within the public, within the military, within Whitehall. But there's very little you can do about it until you're given the explicit instruction to do so by the politicians. Because as soon as you start ordering the equipment you might need, well, it looks as though it's a fait accompli and you can't portray it as such. And so, yeah, there was credit that the military managed to get 3 brigades up and running quite quickly, but equipment shortfalls were rife from the start pretty much to the end.
I think, if I may interject, I mean, one of the interesting things is that military planning was where, in a sense, the planning fell down most badly, even though essentially the decision to go to war had been jointly taken back in July 2008, according to these memos that have been published by...
July 2002.
2002, beg your pardon. So, but then, and there's some very interesting stuff that we'll come to later on as we get more, as the document gets published, that indicates the extent to which Tony Blair was helping on both sides of the Atlantic try to build the argument for war, to kind of create, they had the policy, now they were looking for the justification. One of which, of course, was to make the link, an entirely fallacious link, by the way, between Saddam Hussein's regime and Al-Qaeda. Now, it would appear that that was, if not only Mr. Blair's idea, it was certainly something that he suggested to the United States should be done as part of building that argument. That became a very strong part of the argument, although, as we know, anybody who understood the region at all, if there was one set of enemies implacably opposed to each other, it would have been the regime of Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda.
Well, who else is mentioned in this project? I mean, we're thinking here about Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's press secretary, the foreign secretary at the time, Jack Straw, Sir John Dearlove at MI6. Michelle, who else is reading this?
I think that there is criticism right across the board. It's not just Tony Blair and the immediate people who were around him in terms of...
all other families of servicemen and women who died in the Second Iraq War, and on behalf of all those who were injured and all their relatives who were affected. Never again must so many mistakes be allowed to sacrifice British lives and lead to the destruction of a country for no positive end. We were proud when our husbands, sons and daughters signed up to serve our country. We must use this, but we cannot be proud of the way our government has treated them. We must use this report to make sure that all parts of the Iraq war fiasco are never repeated again, neither in a theatre of war nor in the theatre of Whitehall. We call on the British government immediately to follow up Sir John's findings to ensure that the political process by which our country decides to go to war is never again twisted and confused with no liability for such actions. Good government and democracy must not be trampled over, particularly with such costs to British and foreign lives. And to ensure that the internal politics of Whitehall, from the MOD to security services to post-conflict planning, are never allowed to fail so widely. After sufficient time for a proper analysis of Chilcot's report, we reserve the right ourselves to call specific parties to answer for their actions in the courts if such process is found to be viable. We thank Sir John Chilcot for such a detailed and fair report. It has truly been an exhausting and exhaustive process. For the honour and memory of our loved ones, we have encouraged this report since the end of the British engagement in Iraq. We trust that all parties will learn their lessons. It is impossible at this early stage to sum up the report accurately. We have had 180 minutes, a minute for each death, to digest a 7-year project. After sufficient analysis of our own, we reserve the right ourselves to call specific parties to answer for their actions in the courts if such process is found to be viable. Thank you. Now, I'll just ask Matthew Jury to make a short statement.
Afternoon. The families have waited a long time for today to come. They have acted with patience, courage and dignity throughout this entire process. Those who the report has criticised had such sight of criticisms in advance. They knew what was coming and have had time to prepare their statements and defences. The 3 hours the families were given this morning is not long enough for anybody to properly take in 2.5 million words or even a 150-page summary. Today is a day the families should be at the forefront of everybody's minds, but so too should be the thousands of British soldiers wounded in Iraq, the tens of thousands of British veterans who served there, and the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians who died during the conflict and since. The families are pleased that the inquiry has discharged its duties without fear, favour or prejudice. However, they are of course saddened that it appears to have been confirmed that their loved ones died unnecessarily and without just cause or purpose. In the coming days and weeks, the families will undertake a full and forensic review of the report's content and conclusions. If state officials are determined to have acted unlawfully or in excess of their powers, then the families will then decide on whether to take any necessary and appropriate action at the proper time. All options will be considered. Just as importantly, as well as examining the culpability of individual state officials, we must also look at the process that led to the war so that we never make such grave mistakes with such tragic, long-term and far-reaching consequences again. Thank you.
If anybody wants to ask.
David Burgess, can I just ask a quick question? You talk about certain people, state officials. Can you tell us who, having had 3 hours to read the summary, those people might be and what you might want them to face?
The difficulty is, of course, that we've had the executive summary. We haven't had time to go to the full report, which names names, and the executive summary does not, at this stage, name names. So I'm not going to be in a position to, from that, to be able to actually say who, with the exception, of course, of the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who, of course, is mentioned by name in the report. And it's quite clear that there is a lot wanting there.
Mr. Keith, ITV, did your son die in vain?
Well, Alison, the only answer I can give to that is when I look at Iraq on my TV screens today, the 200 plus deaths that took place the other day, I can only conclude that unfortunately and sadly my son died in vain.
Can I ask Tony Hamilton Jewell, can I just ask who you hold responsible? The CEO of all this is Tony Blair. Is that possible that we can take this man to task?
I can't say that we can, because this is where you need to have the proper assessment of what is available to us to find.
What we have said, and we've been very clear on, is that it needs to be a full and forensic analysis. That will take time. Those questions cannot be answered with any degree of certainty at this stage.
Don't you think we've waited long enough?
We have the report today. That is what is important. Over the days and coming weeks, the families will make their decisions as what is necessary and appropriate going forward.
Catherine Jones from Channel...
Sorry,
Catherine Jones from Channel 5 News. Could I ask Sarah and Rose, what have been your abiding emotions this morning as you have read those 180 or so pages?
I think today what we've heard and what we've been reading has been really hard, and I think that's why there's a lot of mothers and fathers that's been in tears today. A lot have held it back for weeks, and what's been confirmed today is really gut-wrenched a lot of us.
And personally for myself, anger, that healing that 11 and a half years I've worked for. I've gone back to that time when I learned that my brother had been killed. And there is one terrorist in this world that the world needs to be aware of, and his name is Tony Blair, the world's worst terrorist.
Martin Geisler from ITV News. What changes with the publication of this report? What does it practically mean?
For me, it means that, well, it's difficult because it means that government itself has got to look at itself in order to change the way that it does this kind of business. Because as everybody is saying, this kind of thing, this must never happen ever again. And it's how you actually achieve the changes required in order to make sure that it never happens again. And that's one of the difficulties. And perhaps, and I don't know yet, and we won't know for some time, that actually bringing people into court to actually have some kind of sanction against them will motivate government into making sure that they change the way that they do business. I mean, there are constitutional issues here, quite clearly, in the long term, in dealing with how you go to war.
I think it's had a worldwide effect. It's an indelible stain on the whole world. It reverberates around the world. And, you know, governments have to recognise that the people that walk past those houses of power, we have voices. And even those that are now no longer with us, we will be their voices, and our voices need to be heard, and we will be heard.
I think what it's changed, Martin, is that now we've had the endorsement of a thorough, robust inquiry, which has confirmed all our the family's fears that these young men and women were deployed on the basis of a falsehood, and now we've had the backing of Sir John with our beliefs, and it has now been documented, and it's given us a launchpad to go forward to search for, yes, more answers, and bring those that we feel who are responsible. Maybe they need to be brought to account, and as Matthew has said, we'll look at whatever's appropriate, given that when we've resourced the findings thoroughly, if that is a viable proposition. We now have some evidence to go forward with.
Can I ask you a slightly different question, but still about courts? It seemed, in delicate language, Sir John Chilcot was nudging somebody towards perhaps having a look in court at the legality issue. He said they hadn't addressed it because they weren't lawyers, but he was pretty clear that it was unsatisfactory, and I thought indicated somebody should probably have a look at it.
Well, he did indicate that the legal process was unsatisfactory, and then obviously we've got Matthew here, who is the legal mind, and he will look at this and decide what is necessary and appropriate given further research into the findings.
I've been